My husband sold my honor across a dinner table, and he did it in a language he was certain I didn't understand. 17 years of marriage. And Marcus still didn't know that the woman sitting across from him in dress blues had spent 5 years at Osan Air Base, fluent enough in Korean to brief general officers without an interpreter in the room. He raised his glass to a stranger that night and said the words that ended us right there under the flag-draped ceiling of the Fort Benning Officers Club. In a room he'd rented because he thought it would impress everyone in it, except me. He never once considered that I might be listening. He was wrong, and the price he paid for that mistake was worth a great deal more than the $22 million he was trying to save. My name is Dana Whitfield. Before that, I was Dana Voss, and before that, I was nothing but a girl from a dying steel town in Ohio who joined the Army at 18 because it was the only door that opened when I pushed on it. 17 years later, I was a major in Army military intelligence, a woman who had briefed convoy routes in Kandahar and spent 5 years reading the space between words in a language most Americans couldn't place on a map. I tell you this not to impress you, but because it matters to what happened next. It matters because my husband looked at me for 17 years and saw a uniform he could borrow the credibility of, not a mind he ever bothered to actually meet. Marcus had been planning that dinner for weeks. He rented the private dining room at the Officers Club, a space usually reserved for retirement ceremonies and dining outs, because he wanted the polish of military tradition without the substance of it. He told me it was the most important night of his career. Whitfield Dynamics, the defense contracting company he'd built from nothing and was now watching slide toward bankruptcy, needed $22 million from Sungwoo Defense, a South Korean firm willing to invest in a new guidance component line for tactical drones. General Han Jo-woo, a retired two-star who now sat on Sungwoo's board, was flying in personally to decide whether his company would sign. Marcus needed this deal the way a drowning man needs air. He needed it more than he had ever needed anything, including, it turned out, me. 3 days before the dinner, he came home with a garment bag, my dress blues, freshly pressed, my ribbons polished by someone other than me for the first time in 17 years. I thought for one foolish second that it was a gesture of respect. Then he set the bag on the bed and said, "Just stand there and look the part tonight. Let me do the talking." General Han respects the uniform. He doesn't need to hear you explain the technical specs. That's not your lane tonight. I let that sentence sit in the room without answering it. I had learned over 17 years that some comments were better absorbed than fought. I had also learned over 17 years in a profession built on patience that the moment you show your hand is the moment you lose the game. I want to tell you about the years before that dinner because I think you deserve to understand how a person ends up sitting silent through her own betrayal instead of screaming the moment it starts. It wasn't one dinner. It was 17 years of small erosions, each one small enough to forgive, until forgiving had become a reflex instead of a choice. The first time was at a company holiday party, 10 years into our marriage. I was a captain by then, 3 years past my deployment, already known in my unit for a report on procurement fraud that had gotten 2 contractors debarred. Marcus introduced me to a room full of investors as my wife. She handles some administrative things over at Benning. Administrative things. I had briefed a division commander 2 weeks earlier. I laughed it off in the car. I told myself he simply didn't know how to talk about my job to civilians. I told myself a lot of things that year. The second time 5 years ago, I found my name and rank listed in a Whitfield Dynamics marketing brochure as an honorary military advisor to the company, a title I had never agreed to, attached to a photo I didn't remember consenting to use. When I asked him about it, he said, "It's good for optics, Dana. Investors like knowing there's a real soldier behind the brand. It doesn't cost you anything." I believed him because believing him had always been easier than the alternative, which was admitting that my name had become a line item on his balance sheet. The third time was only 8 months before that dinner. He handed me a stack of papers at the kitchen table and said, "Just sign where I flagged it. It's insurance paperwork for the company. Standard stuff." I signed. I didn't read them carefully. I was tired and Sophie needed help with a history project, and signing felt faster than arguing. It would be months before I understood exactly what I had signed and what it would come to mean. I used to call all of this, just the way Marcus is. I know now that each time I let it pass, I was teaching him something. I was teaching him that my silence was reliable. I was teaching him that he could use my name, my rank, my uniform without asking, and that I would absorb it and move on. I didn't know that every time I looked away, I was helping him build the cage he would eventually try to sell tickets into. There's a reason Marcus never suspected how much I understood that night, and it isn't a plot hole in my life. It's a decision I made a long time ago for reasons that had nothing to do with him. I spent 5 years stationed at Osan working alongside the Republic of Korea Army in a joint intelligence billet, reaching a 4 out of 4 on the Defense Language Proficiency Test in Korean, the highest rating the military gives, the kind reserved for people trusted to sit in rooms where mistranslation could cost lives. It is not a skill you pick up for fun. It's a skill the Army spends years and real money building in you, precisely because it's meant to be used quietly by people who don't announce what they know. I came home from Korea and married a man who never once asked what those 5 years had actually required of me. Not because he was incurious by nature, Marcus was plenty curious about anything that could be monetized, but because the specifics of military intelligence work are, by design, not something spouses are supposed to probe. "I can't really talk about the details" became a sentence he heard so often in our first years of marriage that he simply stopped listening for what might come after it. It was easier for him to assume my competence stopped exactly where his curiosity did. But I'll be honest with you, because this story only means something if I am. It wasn't only operational security that kept me quiet. There was a night, early in our marriage, when I said a few words in Korean to a Korean-American colleague at a barbecue, and Marcus laughed and said, "Look at you, showing off." I remember the particular shape of that laugh, not cruel exactly, but dismissive. The laugh of a man who found it faintly ridiculous that his wife might contain something he hadn't cataloged. I didn't correct the impression that I'd said a handful of memorized phrases. I let him believe it, and in the 17 years that followed, I never spoke a full sentence of Korean in front of him again. I kept that part of myself the way you keep an old key to a door you're not sure you'll ever need to open again. On the night I'm about to describe to you, I needed it. The dinner started the way these dinners always do, cordial, cautious, full of the particular choreography of men deciding how much of themselves to reveal to each other. General Han was polite, watchful, a man who had clearly spent 30 years learning to say very little while gathering a great deal. His daughter, Yuna Han, sat beside him, a sharp-eyed attorney who, I would learn later, actually held final signing authority over Sung-woo's board decisions. A fact Marcus either didn't know or had chosen not to weigh properly. Marcus talked big. Projections, timelines, numbers that sounded confident and rounded in ways that didn't quite match the spreadsheets I'd glimpsed months earlier, open on his home office monitor, numbers that had grown suspiciously generous to his case since then. General Han asked, with the calm precision of a man who had read every page of the proposal twice, about the field certification status of the guidance components. Whether the drone navigation units had cleared independent safety testing. It was a fair question. It was, in fact, the only question that mattered. Marcus's answer wandered, vague, over-rehearsed, full of phrases like "in the final stages" and "substantially complete." And then, when his English started running out of road, when the general silence made it clear the vague answer hadn't landed, Marcus leaned toward the general's aide, a younger Sungwoo staffer with limited English who'd been quietly translating for the general's benefit, and switched to Korean. He thought it made him safe. He thought the room had exactly one man in it who could understand what he was about to say, and that the man was on his side. "Don't worry about the field testing," he said, low, almost casual, the way men trade something between themselves they'd never put in an email. "My wife will sign off on the verification report if we need her to. She's military. Nobody questions a soldier's signature. She's never once asked me a question about the business. She won't start now." I did not flinch. I did not drop my fork or let my face do anything at all. I had sat through worse rooms than this one, rooms where a single expression could cost an informant his life. I set my water glass down slowly, the way you learn to move when you need a moment. The room doesn't notice you taking, and I said in English, "Excuse me, I need to check in with my duty section for a moment." Marcus didn't even look up. I heard him already pivoting, already selling something else. Some other version of the woman he thought was still sitting at that table. I walked out of that room with my heels steady on the polished floor and my pulse steadier than it had any right to be. In my head, in a language he didn't know I possessed, I was already writing the report. I didn't go to the ladies' room to cry. I went to a quiet hallway near the coat check, pulled out my phone, and called a number I hadn't dialed in 3 years. The personal line of Colonel Grace Okafor, my former battalion commander from an earlier assignment. Now serving with the Army's Criminal Investigation Division specializing in defense contract fraud. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. Ma'am, it's Dana Whitfield. I need to report something and I need you to tell me if I'm reading this correctly. Go ahead, Major. I gave it to her the way I'd been trained to give a report, clean, sequenced, no editorializing. Time, location, exact language, context. I told her my husband, CEO of Whitfield Dynamics, had just told a foreign investor's representative in Korean that he intended to have me, a serving Army officer, sign a false field verification report for guidance components destined for military drones in order to close a $22 million investment deal. There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of someone doing very fast math. Did the investor agree to this? No, ma'am. I don't think General Han has any idea what was just said. It wasn't said to him, it was said past him to his aide, in a language my husband assumed was private. And you're certain of the translation? Ma'am, I scored a 4-4 at DLIFLC, I'm certain. Another pause. Then, don't confront him. Don't warn him. Go back in there, act like nothing happened, and document everything you can for memory the moment you're somewhere private. I want a full statement within the hour. If what you're describing is accurate, this stopped being a marriage problem the second he said the word verification report. This is potential fraud against the Department of Defense, possibly a national security issue depending on what those components actually are. I want to be clear about something here because it matters. And because I know better than most people how easily a good story gets bent out of shape by a detail that doesn't hold up, I did not record that conversation on my phone. Georgia is a one-party consent state for civilian recordings, but the conversation I'd overheard involved a federal contracting matter, and I had spent 17 years learning that the value of evidence lies in how cleanly it was gathered, not how dramatically. What I had was better than a recording, in the way that matters. I had training. I had a memory built to hold exact phrasing under pressure, because that was quite literally my job. And I had a chain of command that existed specifically to receive reports like the one I was about to give. I straightened my jacket, checked my reflection, steady eyes, nothing betraying me, and walked back into that dining room like nothing had happened at all. Marcus asked if I was all right. I told him my duty section had needed a signature verification, nothing urgent. He nodded, already turning back to General Han, already sliding back into the easy confidence of a man who believed the hardest part of his evening was behind him. He didn't slip back into Korean again. He didn't need to, he thought. The important thing had already been said and understood by exactly the people he intended it for. I let the rest of the meal wash over me. I answered General Han's polite questions about my time in Korea in careful, unremarkable English, watching him watch me with the particular attentiveness of a man who had spent 30 years learning to notice what other people missed. I noticed something too, a small persistent discomfort in the way Yunahan kept glancing at her father's untouched second glass of wine, at the way Marcus refilled it a little too eagerly, a little too often, as if generosity could substitute for candor. At one point, near the end of the meal, General Han asked again, more directly this time, in English, no longer willing to let vagueness stand, whether the field certification would be complete before the funds transferred. Marcus said, without missing a beat, everything will be in order. I give you my word as a businessman and as someone who married into this country's military family. I remember exactly how my hand tightened around the stem of my water glass when he said that. Married into this country's military family, as though my 17 years of service were a wedding gift he'd received rather than a life I had built with my own hands, one I had nearly died for twice. I had learned a long time ago in a dust-choked convoy outside Kandahar how to stand still when everything in you wants to move. I did it again now. I set the glass down instead of throwing it. Not because the anger wasn't real. It was as real as anything I had ever felt, but because I understood with total clarity that the version of justice I wanted wasn't a scene in a dining room. It was watching him lose everything, slowly, in a way no one could later dismiss as a wife's overreaction. A scene would have made me the story. I wanted him to be the story instead. The dinner ended with handshakes and the particular warmth men extend to each other when they believe a deal is close. Marcus was electric in the car, already rehearsing the announcement he'd make to his board. I told him I'd been placed on standby recall, a lie, but a useful one, the kind no military spouse questions, because standby recalls are simply part of the fabric of that life. I told him I needed to report to my unit that night and might not be back until the following evening. He didn't ask a single follow-up question. That, more than anything else that night, told me everything about how little space I actually occupied in his imagination of his own life. I didn't go to my unit. I checked into a hotel 11 minutes from post, and from a hard chair at a laminate desk, I did the things a soldier does when the mission has changed and the old plan no longer applies. I called the JAG office's after-hours line and spoke with a military attorney about my rights and my exposure, because Marcus had without my knowledge put my name on paperwork I'd signed at that kitchen table 8 months earlier. And I needed to understand exactly what that paperwork said before I decided my next move. I forwarded to my personal email every document I could find on our shared cloud drive that carried my name, rank, or signature. I changed the password on my thrift savings plan account and my personal bank accounts I had never thought to separate from him because separating them had never once seemed necessary in 17 years of believing we were, as he liked to say, a team. I want to say something plainly here because I think it matters to anyone who has ever wondered why a person doesn't leave the very instant. The ground shifts under them. Leaving isn't a single door you walk through. It's 100 small doors, and you have to find and open every one of them, often in the dark, often while the person who built the walls around you is still asleep 2 rooms away, still certain you're exactly where he left you. I found my doors that night. I opened every one I could reach before sunrise. By the time General Han's team convened for the formal signing meeting the next morning, Colonel Okafor had already opened a preliminary inquiry and Yuna Han, who it turned out, held final authority over any Sungwoo investment above $10 million, a fact Marcus had either never learned or never respected enough to ask about, had requested a private meeting with me before anyone signed anything at all. Yuna met me in a small conference room off the main hall, just the 2 of us, before the larger meeting was scheduled to begin. She didn't waste time either. My father served in the Republic of Korea Army for 22 years, she said in unaccented English, watching me with the same careful attentiveness her father had shown at dinner. He would tell you that the worst kind of dishonesty is the kind that hides behind someone else's honor. Last night, at dinner, your husband said something to my father's aide. My father didn't catch all of it. His Korean has drifted since he moved into international business, and honestly, he was more focused on the wine than the words. But my father's aide understood every word and reported it to me this morning out of concern. I wanted to hear your account before I decided anything. I told her, in Korean, exactly what I had heard. I watched something settle in her face. Not surprise exactly, but the particular grim satisfaction of someone whose instincts have just been confirmed. You speak Korean, she said. It wasn't quite a question. I do. He doesn't know that. No, I said. He's never known a great many things about me. Yuna sat back. Sungwoo Defense is not interested in being party to fraud against the United States military, Major Whitfield. And I am not interested in signing away $22 million to a man who believes evidence can be manufactured by a woman's uniform. Whatever happens next between you and your husband is not my business. What happens to this contract is, the formal meeting that followed was not the triumph Marcus had spent weeks rehearsing. General Han, once briefed by his daughter, asked Marcus directly, in English this time, no room for the comfort of assumed privacy, to explain what he had meant at dinner, by telling his aide that Dana would sign off on the field verification report. Marcus, smooth as ever under normal pressure, tried the oldest excuse in the book, that something had been lost in translation, that his aide had misunderstood a joke. That Korean carried idiom and nuance that didn't always survive the crossing into a second language. That was the moment I spoke, for the first time all morning, in unhurried, exact Korean, repeating back to him, word for word, what he had said the night before. There was no nuance to misplace. He had said the certifications were not yet complete. He had said I would sign whatever he needed signed, because I never asked questions. Marcus went completely still. It is a strange thing, watching a man's face when he understands all at once that the person he most took for granted has been fully present the entire time. I have seen a lot of strange things in 17 years. I don't think I will ever forget that one. Colonel Okafor, who had flown in that morning on the strength of my report, entered the room shortly after with a CID liaison and formally requested that all field verification documentation for the drone guidance program be frozen pending review. It came out over the following weeks, through documents, not recordings, through the kind of careful, unglamorous forensic work that real investigations actually consist of, that Marcus had used my name and military reference number on verification paperwork for at least 4 prior contracts, attesting to field testing that a decorated Army officer had supposedly signed off on, testing that, according to the sworn statement of a former Whitfield Dynamics quality engineer named Rene Castillo, had never actually taken place to specification. Rene had been let go 18 months earlier after raising concerns internally about the guidance unit's failing cold weather tolerance tests. She kept her own file of the emails that had gotten her pushed out, emails in which Marcus wrote with a carelessness that would eventually cost him everything, that the report only needed to survive long enough for board approval, and that the field data could be finalized retroactively once funding cleared. Sergeant Leo Park, a young non-commissioned quality technician who'd been pressured to file the falsified reports, broke down during his own interview with CID investigators. He hadn't known, he said, that his signature was being paired with a fabricated version of a major's endorsement he'd never actually received. He cooperated fully once he understood the scope of what he'd been asked to be part of. I remember one thing said in a later closed-door session with Army contracting oversight officials, not because it was said to me, but because of what it meant about the size of the wound Marcus had actually opened. A senior contracting officer, reviewing the preliminary findings, said something I've thought about many times since. This isn't the first time we've found a defense contractor cutting a corner this way, and it won't be the last. We've gotten too comfortable trusting a clean-looking report without asking hard enough who's actually behind the signature on it. Somewhere out there, there are soldiers who would have trusted their lives to guidance components that were never properly tested, because a company needed a deal to close before its books came due. I sat with that for a long time. It reframed the whole thing for me in a way I hadn't expected. This had started as the worst night of my marriage. It ended up being about something much larger than my marriage, about the quiet, unglamorous ways trust gets weaponized in systems built to protect people who will never know how close they came to being failed by a name they'd never even heard. Marcus tried, predictably, to spread the blame. He told investigators Leo Park had acted on his own initiative. Leo, pale and shaking, said he'd only ever done what he was told, by a man who had never once let him say no. Rene Castillo's records did the rest of the talking documents could do. Clean, dated, unambiguous, the opposite of drama, and exactly as damning. When it was over, when the Army's contracting fraud investigators, the Department of Justice liaison assigned under the False Claims Act, and Sungwoo's legal team had all seen enough, Marcus's composure finally broke. He stopped denying and started pleading. He said everything he'd done was for the company, for the 211 employees whose jobs depended on that funding round, that I was letting my anger destroy something he'd spent 15 years building. You didn't build this for them, I told him. You used them as collateral, the way you used me. He asked quietly whether I had ever actually loved him. I loved the man I believed you were becoming, I said. I'm done sacrificing for the one you actually chose to be. I signed the divorce filing I had already prepared with military legal assistance in the days since that first sleepless hotel room night. I didn't look back on my way out of the room. I won't pretend Marcus faced instant cinematic justice, because that isn't how these things actually go, and I think stories owe their audience the truth about that. Whitfield Dynamics lost its Sungwoo funding entirely and, within months, lost several existing government contracts as well, once the falsified verification history came to light during a mandated compliance audit. Marcus was formally charged under the False Claims Act for submitting fraudulent certifications to federal contracting officers, a charge that, unlike the sweep of a single dramatic confrontation, moved through the slow, grinding machinery of federal investigation for the better part of a year. Leo Park cooperated in exchange for a reduced administrative penalty and kept his security clearance, barely. Rene Castillo's name was formally cleared of the retaliation complaint the company had once dismissed, and she was hired not long after as a compliance consultant for the very oversight office that had investigated her former employer. My own divorce was its own long, unglamorous fight. Asset division custody arrangements for Sophie. Months of forensic accounting to untangle exactly which parts of our life together had quietly been mortgaged against a company I'd never asked to be part of. I filed for and was granted a protective order limiting Marcus's access to shared accounts and requiring supervised contact with Sophie during the worst of it. Once it became clear he was trying to turn her against me by telling her I had destroyed the family out of jealousy over his success. I didn't fight that narrative by handing our 16-year-old daughter every ugly detail. I gave her only what a 16-year-old needed to carry. Your father made some very serious mistakes, I told her across our kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee I wasn't really drinking. I'm not asking you to choose a side. I'm asking you to understand that staying quiet doesn't actually hold a family together. It just delays the moment it breaks. She was angry at first, confused, caught between two versions of the same man. But once she was old enough and the case had progressed far enough to see the parts of the record that were appropriate for her, something in her shifted. She stopped seeing what I'd done as revenge and started seeing it for what it actually was. I want to be honest about the part of this story people don't usually put in the version with a tidy ending. There was no windfall waiting for me on the other side of that courtroom. I had to rebuild credit that had quietly been damaged by joint debt I hadn't known existed. I had to refile years of tax paperwork that had been mishandled without my knowledge. I moved into a modest two-bedroom house near Sophie's school, close enough to post that I could still make morning formation on the days it mattered. I didn't ask for special treatment when I applied to transfer into the Army's contract fraud investigative branch, the same field that had, indirectly, undone the life I'd built with Marcus. I sat through the interviews. I completed the required coursework. I competed for the position against officers with cleaner service records and fewer complications trailing behind them. I earned the transfer the same way I'd earned every rank before it, on the strength of the work, not the sympathy of the story. Within a year, I was leading a small team responsible for reviewing exactly the kind of field certification fraud that had once been used against my own name. There is a particular, quiet satisfaction in that kind of symmetry that I don't think I can fully explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. I don't do the work out of vengeance. I do it because I understand, in a way I didn't fully understand before that dinner, exactly how much damage one convenient lie can do to people who will never know your name. Marcus requested a final meeting through our attorneys months later to finalize the plea agreement and the last details of our settlement. He looked smaller across that conference table than I remembered him ever looking, the confidence gone, something hollow standing in its place. I just need you to believe I never meant for it to go this far, he said. I believed you for 17 years, I told him. Believing was never what was missing between us. He asked one last time if I had ever really loved him. I loved the man I thought you were, I said. I'm not going to keep sacrificing myself for the one you decided to become. I signed the last of the papers. I stood up. I didn't look back. Sometimes I think about that dinner at the officers' club, the exact moment my marriage actually ended. It wasn't the divorce filing. It wasn't the conference room where Marcus finally broke. It was a table under a flag, chandelier light on white tablecloths, my husband speaking a language he assumed I couldn't hear. But the moment that mattered most that night wasn't his sentence at all. It was mine, the choice not to react the way he expected, the choice to trust what my own training, my own years, my own quiet, hard-won competence told me was true, instead of accepting whatever explanation he might later try to offer for it. If you are a military spouse reading this, if you have ever felt your service, your rank, your name treated as a prop in someone else's ambition instead of a life you built with your own two hands, I want you to hear this clearly. That is never a price you owe anyone. I lost a marriage. I have never, not for a single day since, lost the person I swore an oath to become. They say a marriage ends the day the papers are signed. That wasn't true for me. Mine ended at a dinner table, in a language my husband thought I couldn't hear. But my life didn't end there. It started again. Because the moment someone decides your honor is a fair price for their ambition, you stop owing them the job of protecting their dreams. You start protecting your own. What would you have done if you were sitting at that table? Would you have confronted him right there or waited the way I did until you had enough to make it undeniable? Tell me in the comments and let me know where you're serving from tonight.